daf on Motzaei Shabbat is daf Lamed Tet 39 in Masechet Bava Batra. We're still in the third parak, which we will be for quite some time. Cheskat Batim, and the question that we're up to, 3 lines from the bottom. It's 2 dots. 3 lines from the bottom of Lamed Chet Amabet comes to the fundamental question that we discussed in our Mishnah yesterday, and we'll continue discussing, which is how do you make a macha'a, right? The principle is that if someone, generally, if you buy property, you should have a contract that says that you own the property, right? But they have a special rule that since contracts are not necessarily so easy to keep, or people can't store documents reliably, or whatever the reason, the things get ruined, it's a hard thing. That if a person has been living in a land for 3 years and the previous owner of the land has not objected, then if you say, I had a contract, but I lost it, you're believed, because that sort of replaces your contract. But we said that, let's say, remember we had last week a whole bunch of situations in which people were living on land without having bought it, right? We're just getting started, Robert, don't worry. There are people living on land they haven't necessarily bought. We are on today's daf is daf Lamed Tet, and we are 3 lines from the bottom of Lamed Chet Amabet 38b. So what happens if someone's living on land that they didn't buy, like they're a sharecropper, or they got it as a guarantor in a loan, right? We've had all these loans where you say, I borrowed $1 million from you, take my property for 5 years, and that'll be essentially the repayment for the loan, right? Called the mashkanta desura. So how do you know that person is legitimately on the land, but he didn't buy it? So how do you prevent him from saying that it's his? So we said in the Mishnah, you can make a macha'a, you can make a objection. You can get up and say, this person's on my land, but they didn't buy it from me. Either they stole it from me, or they're legitimately because they're my sharecropper, or they're renting it from me. So you have to get up and make that announcement. Ask the Gemara today, the bottom of Lamed Chet Amabet, Hechi Dami Macha'a. What do you say? Like, what do you get up and say? So Amar Ivzvid, what you say is the following, 2 lines from the bottom. Palnaya Gazlanahu. If you say, my field, well, so let me just put out one other thing before I translate this. The purpose of the Macha'a is that if, let's say, a person's living on a field, the rabbis assess that they have a right to say, I had a shtar and I lost my shtar. But if someone makes a macha'a, if the previous owner gets up and says, wait a second, this is still my field, then you have no excuse for losing your shtar. Because if you know that someone's going to question your ownership, then you've got to hold on to it. And the fact that you don't have a shtar looks very, very suspicious. So in the case of a macha'a, your fact that you don't have a shtar is really very suspect. So says the Gemara now.
He's been there for 3 years, right? Suppose he's been there for 3 years.
At least 3 years, right? Could be more, it could be 10 years. But we'll see. We're going to discuss how often you have to make a macha'a.
But how is it? How can the owner object now? This fellow's been there for 3 years.
No. So once a person's been there for 3 years, you don't make a macha'a. You can't make a macha'a. We're going to discuss that today. We'll get to the timing when you have to do it. Says the Gemara, though, what do you say though? So if you get up, if the previous owner, who might still be the owner, but he's certainly the previous owner, says, Palnaya Gazlanahu, Ploni, this person who's now living on my field, is a Gazlan. He's a thief. So that's all you say, right? So you might think that therefore the guy living on the field is like, wait a second, this guy's accusing me of being a thief. I better cover my bases and keep my shtar. Says the Braita, no. Says the Gemara, sorry, lo havi macha'a. That's not a macha'a because you weren't specific about your claim. You didn't say he stole this field. You just said this guy's no good for nothing. That's not specific enough to require the person to keep the shtar. But if you say, Palnaya Gazlanahu, this guy is a Gazlan because because he's sitting on my land illegally, right? And now the Rashbam reads the next 3 words on top of Lamed Tet Amud Aleph, Ulamachar Tavana Ledina, and I'm going to bring him to court, right? Like people say, this guy, I'm going to sue him. So once you say that, and this the Rashbam understands you have to have these last lines too, because even if you just said so-and-so is a Gazlan and took my field, people again might assume that you're just, people say all kinds of things that they don't mean. I mean, people say it all the time. I'm going to sue you. I'm going to do this. And they don't necessarily mean it. And therefore, you have to say the last part. It's the Rashbam quotes from Rabbeinu Chananel here, that you have to say the last part, that L'machar Tavana Le'Dina, that tomorrow or in the future, I'm going to bring him to court. That's Havi Macha'a. I'm Miriam, good morning, in Israel. So that's a Macha'a. So we are up to the second line now of Daf Lamed Tet Amud Aleph. We're talking about what you say. So in order to make a macha'ah, so the second line starts, Amar, if you say, lo timrule. Let's say a guy, owns a field. Someone else is now living on his field. He hears about that and he goes to two people or three people. We're going to see how many you have to go to in a second, and says, look, this guy is living on my land illegally, but please don't tell him I said this. I'm scared of him or whatever. I don't lo timrule. Don't say it to him. So Mai, is that a macha or not a macha? Right? 2 years later, the guy comes. Let's say it's the first year he's living on the land. You say the statement. 2 years later, 3 years have now passed. The guy says it's my land. And you say, no. I have witnesses that 2 years ago I said you're living illegally on my land, but I told the witnesses not to tell you. Right? So what's the halacha? Amar of Zvid, well, it doesn't count as a macha because kamar lo timrle. You said don't tell him. Right? And the whole point of a macha, if you recall, is that if a person knows that someone is questioning their ownership of the land, they have to keep their shtar. And the fact that they didn't keep their shtar shows that they didn't have a shtar. But if you told the witnesses not to tell him, then you can't rely on him knowing it. Amar of Papa, so that's what Rav Zvid says. Rav Papa says, no. He didn't say he didn't say to them, right, don't tell anybody. He's l'didei lo timrele, right? He said to him, meaning to the person I accuse of being in my land, don't say. Lachwina imrele, that you can have other people say it to him. And as we've said before, chavrecha chavra itle, right? Your friend has another friend, and chavra de chavrecha chavra itle, and that person is another friend. And once you say it to these people and you expect that they're going to repeat it, even if you said to them, don't tell it to that guy, they're going to tell it to other people who will tell it to that guy. And so you can make a safe assumption that just spreading the word out there, saying at the Shul Kiddush, so-and-so is illegally in my land, don't tell him I said that, right? Someone else is going to hear about it and someone else is going to tell him. And therefore that counts as a macha'ah according to Rav Papa. Now, let's say let me just point out, the words are very similar here, so it's a little hard to find the place. 2, 4, 6 lines from the top. Amrulay, now if the witnesses say to you, right, you go up to these two people at the Shul Kiddush, let's say, and you say, Shimon is on my land illegally, and I'm going to bring him to court. And the guys say to you, we're not telling him, we're not going to report, we don't want part of this, right? Amrulay, lo amrinalay. The witnesses say to you, we're not going to tell him, right? So now the question is, 2 years pass, you didn't tell anybody else that this is a problem, and the guy says, this is my land. And you say, no, I made a macha. But the witnesses who you made your macha'ah to said, we're not going to tell him. So you couldn't have relied on that as a macha'ah. And if you really wanted to make one, you'd have to go find new witnesses. So says Rav Zvid, that doesn't count because ha'ka'amar lei, ha'ka'amru lei, lo amrin lei. The witnesses said to you, we're not going to tell him. So therefore, what you said to them is not feasible. It doesn't mean anything. Rav Papa again says, no. The same thing is true. What he said is, we're not going to tell them. L'didei lo amrin lei. To him, we're not going to say, but the witnesses never said we're never going to speak a word about what you just told us. They didn't say we're going to keep this, under the hood. They said, we're not doing your dirty work. We're not going and telling this guy, this thug who's on your land, that you're angry with him. But we'll tell somebody else, and somebody else will tell somebody else, and eventually he's going to hear. Chavra, same principle. Chavrecha chavra itle. Your friend has a friend, and chavra de chavrecha chavra itle, and that person has a friend. And once you start saying things, right, it's going to spread. And therefore, once I said to witnesses, or again, I keep saying witnesses, but let's just say individuals, this guy is on my field illegally, even if they respond to me and say, we're not going to go tell him that you're upset at him, we still assume that they're going to tell somebody and the word's going to get out and he should hear that someone is claiming that he's on the land illegally. And if that's the case, he's got to keep the shtar. And if he doesn't keep the shtar, he loses the land. Now,
and we had a situation yesterday in which we said chavra regarding the person who was muhsak in the land for 3 years, whatever, and that because we said there's a cold. For
correct.
that, there's a cold, but for the person who could make a mecha'ah, could protest, he sort of kept it quiet. Then he didn't make it loud. For that, there's not a cold because it's not. Doesn't project that to the community, and therefore maybe he doesn't have a mecha'ah. That seemed to be what it was in the case yesterday.
Right. So it always, again, it depends on the context, depends on who you're saying it to. Here, the point is that if you just say it to one person, let's just say, it doesn't necessarily spread that way. right? Because it's the person who's on the land who really has the responsibility to establish their own ownership. The onus is on you to prove you bought this because it previously belonged to somebody else. We know that. But this case today is where you're saying this in a public forum, right? And again, we're going to define in a minute, I'm not giving it away, what a public forum means, whether it's in front of two people as witnesses or three people as a larger forum. But it's certainly when you're saying it not individually, but you're saying it in a public forum. So here, what we're saying is that even if you ask the people you told it to not to tell him, or the people you told said, I'm not going to tell him, that doesn't mean word is not going to get out. But what about the next case? Amar lahu, if you say to you, again, the previous owner, say to these two men or three men or people standing and say, this guy's in my field and he didn't buy my field, right? Either he stole it, which is what we said earlier, or he's a sharecropper. But listen, I don't want this to leave your lips. Amar lo tepik lechu shuta. Don't let it leave your mouth. I don't want you to repeat it to anybody, which is different than what he said before. Before he said, don't tell the guy, right? And we said, well, you'll tell somebody else and the word will get around. But here he's saying, I swear you to secrecy, right? He doesn't use the word swear, which would mean something different. But I want you to be secret about this. So there it's a little bit stronger. There, says Rav Zvid, well, he said to him, don't tell anybody. If you say don't tell anybody, the hakamar lo tepik l'chushuta, then Amar, right? Then it's a problem. If he said to them, don't tell anybody, then he's not going to tell anybody. And therefore, the one who made the macha'ah should assume that it's not a real macha'ah. Because the people you announced it to are not going to tell anybody. And therefore, it's basically not a valid macha'ah. And if you want to make a new one, you can make a new one. But if you don't, you're going to lose the land. However, the next case, let's just read the next one. We'll see, very interesting. Where am I? Amrulay, if the witnesses who you told it to, the opposite party says, lo mafkinan shuta, right? If the witnesses you said it to said, we're not going to open our mouths, we're not going to say anything about that, right? Then, Rav Papa is quoted as saying, well, okay, then it doesn't count as a macha, right? Papa Amar, Rav Zvid, so I got the wrong names. Amar of Papa, Haka Amri lo mafkinan shuta. Then you said to them, don't say anything about it. But Rav Huna, and therefore it's not a macha. But Rav Huna Breid Yeshua Amar, Rav Huna Breid Yeshua says, I disagree in this case. And the reason I disagree in this case is because Kol Milta de la Ramya Aled de Inish. Anything that's not Ramya, it means like a command on that person, right? It's not a responsibility for that person. Amar la v'lav adate. Meaning, the person you said it to is you said, look, you said to them, this is what happened, and I lost my field. This guy's taking my field. And they say, we're not going to whisper a word about this to anybody. The reality is that since you didn't ask them not to, right? They're just doing it on their own volition. And there's really no incentive, as the Rashbam explains. There's no reason why they shouldn't be doing it. We assume that they're going to slip up and say something. That at some point over the next period of time, they're going to mention to somebody else, oh, by the way, you know what I heard? Because no one asked them. Meaning if in the first case, you said to them, I swear you to secrecy, right? Please don't share this information. So you've asked them not to do it. They'll respect what you said. But here, because they took it upon themselves, they basically said, we are not going to do it. That's the quote. Anything that there's no real impetus for a person to do, or milta de la ramya ledinish, they're going to end up saying it. And you can assume, which I would say is a safe assumption whenever you tell anyone anything, right, is that they are presumably going to tell other people. And in which case, you can assume it's a macha'ah, and the guy who's in the field will hear about it and has to keep his shtar. Now, the Rashbam keeps pointing out throughout this, Tosfos does this as well, that in all these cases, none of it really has to do with the facts, right? It's not, what if the guy says to you, the guy who's on the field, I never heard. It doesn't matter if you never heard. The reality is that you could have heard, because since the previous owner of the field said it to a few people, and those people generally talk, and the assumption is that people say things about it, if you wanted to gather the information, the onus is on you to ask around before you lose your shtar, right? Because really, you should have a shtar. Before you lose your shtar, make sure nobody's talking about this field, right? Before you say, I'm going to get rid of the shtar, you should be sort of inquiring about, I'm not exactly sure how you do this, that to make sure that nobody is questioning your ownership over the field. And so the onus is really on that person. And if the word is out in the world that the previous owner is claiming that you're on it illegally, you better hold on to your shtar. And so again, that's the underlying principle, is that you really should hold on to your star. Before you lose it, you better make sure that there's no questions at all, or you're going to lose your field.
I don't know if that's always valid. He never heard about it. And there was no way he could have. Let's say
No, that's not true. He could have heard it. And that's not. So,
no, if the owner, wait, the cases we discussed yesterday, the day before, the owner's in Spain. He's España, it says. He's somewhere else, and takes a year to get there, and he's a year till they discuss, a year to keep it. It's already 3 years have passed. He may not have heard this. If you could create a case like that. So if he didn't hear about it, why should we make him responsible?
So
that star or whatever it might be.
Right. So we said in the Mishnah, which we're about to quote in the next slide, that you hear about it within 3 years. And we assume, the Rashbam makes the assumption in the Mishnah, which you probably learned yesterday, that a person who owns a property doesn't go 5 years away from his property, right? That you never really, if you own a property, you're going to stay within 1 year's time of your, whatever 1 year travel, which in those days was a lot less than today, right? 1 year travel to your property. So that case, if you're within a year, you assume that the person is going to hear that someone else is in their field and that they're going to have an opportunity to step up and say something about it. So that is the case. If they're further away, they won't, but that's assume that they won't go further away if they still own it. And if the person who is in the field, and that's, we assume that word will spread. The responsibility is for you to inquire about what's happening in your fields if you live far away. And that's what we expect someone's going to know if someone else is living on your property. So let's continue, though. It says the Gemara 2 dots now. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman. This was a discussion we had a lot yesterday, which is, do you have to do this in front of the person, right? If Ruvain previously owned a field, Shimon is now living on the field. Ruvain claims, as we just said, Shimon's on my field illegally or didn't buy it from me. I'm making a macha'a, right? So says Rava, Amar Rav Nachman, macha'a shelo b'fanav havi macha'a. It doesn't have to be in the presence of the guy. It could be even not in front of him. A macha'a not in front of the person, of Shimon, who's on the field, is also a macha'a. Says the Gemara, which is what we said yesterday as halacha, if you recall. But Rava said this in the name of Rav Nachman. But when Rava heard this from Rav Nachman, he asked a question on his teacher, Rav Nachman, from our Mishnah. Eitvei Rava Rav Nachman, how could you, Rav Nachman, say this? Right, I just quoted you. It says in our Mishnah yesterday, what Ken just said, Amar Rav Yehuda, Lo Amru Shalosh Shanim El Kadei Sheba Spamya. Right, they only said 3 years is a chazaka because the owner might be in Spain. That's how we probably translate Aspamya, right? V'yachzik Shana, and some guy is going to live on his land for a year. Then people are going to catch on and talk about why is Shimon living on the land, and they're going to go send the messenger of Yachu V'yodianu Shana. They'll send the messenger to Spain to pass on the word that Shimon's living in Ruvain's land, which will take a year to get there. And then once Ruvain hears, if he wants to come back and make a macha, he's going to take a year to get back. So it's 3 years. He'll come to the 3rd year. Now that was what Rav Yehuda said in our Mishnah. Says Rava to his Rabbi Rav Nachman, why does the Mishnah say he's going to come back, right? Why does he have to come back? He's doing great business in Spain. Let him send back a messenger that'll say, Atza macha, right? I made a macha, and that's the message. If you're true Rav Nachman, the macha'a shelo b'fanav havi macha'a, that a macha'a not in front of the person counts. Lama le'lemeti lahatam. Lama le'lemeti. Why does he have to go back to his place? Leitav hatam aduchte. Let him sit there in his vacation home in Spain. V'limchi hatam, and make a macha'a in that place. Meaning, why does our Mishnah specifically say? We're not asking about the timing, right? Because if you send the messenger, it takes a year, and if you go back, it takes a year. So it doesn't change the timing. The point is, why does the Mishnah specifically say you'll go back, implying you've got to do it in person? Said Rav Nachman to Rava, the Mishnah did not mean to say that you have to go back. The Mishnah was giving you advice. Eitza tova kamashman. It was giving you good advice. The native inishkal ara, that you, Ruvain, who claim it's your land, you should go back before 3 years have passed so you can take your land back. U peri, and you'll get the fruits. Because if you send back a messenger and basically this guy doesn't get off your land and you come back 3 years later, right, and he's been eating the fruits the whole time, good luck collecting those fruits, right? You're never going to see them, right? So you should go back to get your property. That's all the Mishnah is advising you, not that you have to. To establish ownership, you can send a messenger. The point is that if someone's living in your property illegally, you should go back and you should get your stuff. So that's the purpose of the Mishnah. Now, says the Gemara, since Rava seemed to ask Rav Nachman this question from our Mishnah, Rav Nachman said, remember, that macha shelo b'fanav is a macha. Rava said, what are you talking about? What about our Mishnah? So it says the Gemara, motive le Rava le Rav Nachman. Since Rava asked a question to Rav Nachman from our Mishnah, Michlal, it implies the low sphere le the Micha shelo b'fanav havi Micha. It implies that Rava thought Rav Nachman was wrong. Rav Nachman said a halacha that you can object not in front of the person, and Rava said you're wrong, and I'll prove it to you from our Mishnah. Right now, Rav Nachman had an answer, but Rava seemed to argue with his teacher Rav Nachman. But the problem is that yesterday, if you recall, if you remember, we said Amar Rava. Rava was quoted yesterday. Now, the Gemara probably didn't have Daf Yomi this order, so they didn't have it yesterday. But they knew that Rava was quoted as saying that, in fact, halacha is macha shelo b'fanav havi macha. So Rava, in fact, holds that way. Paskin said it is a macha. So why is he asking questions on Rav Nachman, his teacher, who said the exact same thing he said? Says the Gemara, that's the process, right? Batra deshama me Rav Nachman savra. Rava was not sure. Rav Nachman said that's the halacha. Rava asked him questions. Once Rav Nachman satisfactorily answered his questions, Rava adopted that opinion. And so when you read yesterday that Rava paskin that way, it's because the story had already happened, that he had questioned Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman had validated it. And so, in fact, Rava does hold macha shelo b'fanav havi macha, like his teacher Rav Nachman, because of what we said just now.
Well, wasn't the question here that Rava did not hold like him?
That was the question, because by he would ask a question on Rav Nachman, so it's implied that he didn't agree with the opinion of Rav Nachman. He was trying to argue with it. So, but the problem is that we know that Rava holds that is the halacha. So the Gemara answered that. In fact, you're seeing two different stages in Rava's development, right? Earlier, Rava didn't know what the halacha was. He inquired from Rav Nachman because our Mishnah seems to imply something else. Rav Nachman gave a good answer to his satisfaction. Maybe Rava had other questions. Rav Nachman answered, and therefore he adopted the opinion of his teacher, Rav Nachman, and Rava and Rav Nachman now both agree that a macha'a shelo b'fanav is a macha'a. It does count. Now,
where do we see that Rava was made to Rav Nachman? Not right here. Did we see
right here, he just asked a question on Rav Nachman. Eitfei Rava le Rav Nachman. That's Eitfei means the question.
I know, but is that where we're hearing that Rava asked on Rav Nachman?
Yes, that's the question. Continues the Gemara, 4 lines from the bottom. Next, we get to the next rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan, we're going to ask. Ashkechei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina l'tamidav de Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina came to somewhere, I don't know where he showed up, to some hall, some Beit Midrash, and there were students of Rabbi Yochanan. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan was not alive, or maybe it was not where Rabbi Yochanan was. He found the students of Rabbi Yochanan. Amarlu, and he said to them, let me ask you a question. What does Rabbi Yochanan think about this halacha? Kik amar Rabbi Yochanan mach'a, ni amar Rabbi Yochanan mach'a bekama. Did Rabbi Yochanan ever tell you, when you make a mach'a, how many people you have to do it in front of? Right? So we just explained that what you have to say. You have to say, this person's in my land illegally, I'm going to bring him to court. That's what you have to say, right? But how many people have to be standing in front of you? Is it 1 person, 2 people, 5 people? What's the audience? So Reb Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, of course Rabbi Yochanan told us, Macha b'fnei shnayim. You have to have 2 people in front of you. So it has to be a minimum of 2, presumably 2 witnesses, 2 edim, kosher edim, and that's going to count as your macha. Rabbi Avo says, no. Rabbi Yochanan didn't say that. Rabbi Yochanan said, Macha b'fnei shlosha. So obviously, when you ask the students of a teacher, it's common. You'll get 2 different opinions. So one student of Rabbi Yochanan said, he told us in front of 2 people, and one student said in front of 3 people. Okay, now we're not going to be able to resolve this. So the question is, what would be the rationale for each of those opinions? So says the Gemara, Lema, maybe you could say, if you're trying to understand why it would be 2 or 3, that it's an interesting analysis related to the opinion of Rabba bar Rav Huna Kamiflagi. They're arguing about a point made by Rabba bar Rav Huna. As we had, this is not anything to do with us right now. It's the Gemara in Erechin when we talk about the rules of Lashon Hara. And Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna, Rabba bar Rav Huna is quoted in saying, Masechet Erechin, Kol milta de mitamrit ba'ape tlata. Any words, any speech, any fact that's said in front of 3 people, once something has been said in front of 3 people, everybody knows it. And turn the page, Taf Lamed Tet Amud Bet, Let ba mishum lishna bisha. There's no longer a prohibition of Lashon Hara repeating that fact. Because once 3 people have heard something, they, as we have quoted many times, Chavra itlei, v'chavra dechavra itlei. Once you've said something in front of people, everybody knows it. And so it's not considered Lashon Hara. And again, this is very complex sugya of Lashon Hara, but in this opinion, when things are common knowledge, you're just repeating something that either people know or they will find out. Even if you never said it, they were going to find it out. Because once you say something in front of three people, the cat is out of the bag, and everybody's going to find out. So that's what Rabbi Bar Huna said. Okay. Now, Manda Amr Bifnei Shnayim. So if you say that Rabbi Yochanan said that you have to do your macha in front of two people, he clearly disagrees with Rabbi Bar Huna. Let later Rabbi Bar Huna, because he's saying I only informed two people, but two people are blabbered. They'll talk enough that the whole world's going to find out, or the whole city's going to find out. Rabbi Bar Huna said you need three people for the whole city to find out. So clearly that opinion goes against Rabbi Bar Huna. And Man Amr B'fnei Shlosha, but the Amora who quoted Rabbi Yochanan as saying you need it in front of three is exactly like it laid Rabbi Bar Huna. That's the halach of Rabbi Bar Huna. So that's really Rabbi Bar Huna said in Hilchot Lashon Hara that if you say something in front of three people, it's considered to be like everybody knows. And that's the debate. Is that true or not? One opinion is Rabbi Yochanan agrees with that, and you have to have three. The other opinion is that you don't need three, even two people, the word will get out. So that is one understanding. Says the Gemara, that's wrong, right? Lo, that's not the case. Because the Kuli Alma, everybody seems to agree. We have no reason to think Rabbi Bar Huna is wrong. Everybody agrees it's laid Rabbi Bar Huna. That really, for something to be reliably spread in the public information, you got to say it in front of three people. The question here is hacha b'haka miflagi. The debate in Rabbi Yochanan's opinion about whether you have to do a macha in front of two or three depends on the same argument we've had previously, which is whether you have to say it in front of the person, right? Because manda amar mipnei shnayim, one who says Rabbi Yochanan said you only need to do a macha in front of two people, kasavar, he's of the opinion that macha shelo b'fanav lo havi macha. If Ruvain says Shimon's on my field illegally, not in front of Shimon, it doesn't count. It has to be in front of Shimon. Now, once it has to be in front of Shimon, you no longer have to worry about everybody hearing about it. Because the point is, I told Shimon to his face. Now, Shimon's going to deny it. Shimon's going to come to court and say, I never met you before, right? But you have two witnesses. So the two witnesses can testify that you told Shimon to his face. It's not because you need the word to spread. It's because you're talking to him. So then it's enough to do two. Uman damar b'fnei shlosha, with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan that you need three, kasavar, that no, you can do a macha even not in front of the person. Macha shelo b'fanav havi macha. The macha in front of somebody, not in front of somebody, is also a macha. In that case, the point of the macha is to get the word out. And in order to get the word out, everybody agrees that to get a word out, you need three people. And so therefore, if the point of the macha is that he's not present, but he's going to hear about it, you need three. If the point of the macha is that he is present and you're talking to him, then you only need two witnesses to confirm that. So that is the machloket of Rabbi Yochanan. Now says the Gemara, we don't really.
Where's the concept of the Shnei Eidim here? Macha shelo b'fanav, according to the Man Domer, it says you need Shnaim. Where do we? They come to court, the Reuven and Shimon, but where are the Eidim? Do they?
No, they don't go to court. They don't go. There's no court. There's no
court.
You
said, and they could go to court. He could deny it, but we could bring him to court. But where do we bring in two Eidim from this?
You need two Eidim in order for Reuven to establish that he made a macha, because if it's he said, she said, then no one's going to trust him, right? So Reuven just walks up to Shimon in the street and says, "Why are you're stealing my field?" So you and now once Reuven says it to Shimon, in theory, Shimon has to keep the shtar because he knows Reuven's going to challenge his ownership, right? But 3 years later, Shimon says, "I don't know what you're talking about. Reuven never challenged my ownership." So you need two witnesses to establish that Reuven in fact challenged his ownership. So that's
But so who brings the witnesses? Reuven?
Reuven, yeah.
So he brings witnesses as part of his challenge.
Correct. That he challenged.
So why does that prove two instead of three? He could say, I bring three. Or he could bring one. He brings someone else with him.
No, one is not. I
understand that, but okay, so he plus one, or maybe two. Oh,
no, it doesn't work that way, right?
From?
You have to have a minimum of two Eidim. And every time you need Eidut in the world, you have to have two witnesses.
But why then? If it's Eidut, then they go to court, right? You said Correct. They don't go to court, so it's not in the street. It's meaningless.
No, they go to court later. They go to court at some later point. If Reuven comes to Shimon and says, "I want my field back," and Shimon says, "I don't know what you're talking about," then Reuven brings him to court and says, "Look, he doesn't have a shtar. He lived there for 3 years, but I made a macha'ah. I have witnesses that I made a macha'ah, and therefore I get to keep the field."
Wait a minute. He brings the witnesses. So he just brings the witnesses that he made a macha'ah.
Yeah. And then Shimon has to produce a star. And if Shimon can't produce a star, they evict him.
So we're saying this is within the first 3 years then, right?
Potentially. Yeah, we didn't get to the years yet. We're gonna get there later today, I hope.
But
Yeah.
but Shimon could bring 2 witnesses and say, I've been there for 3 years.
Doesn't matter if you've been there 3 years. If you don't have a star and you've been there for 3 years, you don't get to keep it unless no one objected, right? The way Shimon has to prove he owns it is by bringing a star. The fundamental problem here is Shimon does not have a star. If Shimon had a star that he owned it, then there would be nothing to talk about. Shimon has no documents that prove that he owns this, but he's been there for 3 years. So we said the whole concept of chazakah is that replaces the documents,
right?
Unless the previous owner objected. So Reuven in this case objected. No, Shimon says, "I don't know what you're talking about. You never objected."
Wait. Well, when can he object 10 years later?
No, less than 3 years.
Okay, less than 3 years. So we're assuming this is less than 3 years.
Of course.
Okay.
Says the Gemara now, Ibai Dema, but there's another explanation because really we don't like that pshat. That Rabbi Yochanan's 2 or 3 is based on whether you hold mecha shlo b'fanav havi mecha. Because as we said earlier today, Rava and Rav Nachman and pretty much everyone in our Mishnah seems to say that you don't need to do a mecha b'fanav, right? That it counts. So Ibai Dema, then in fact that's the case. The kuli alma mecha shlo b'fanav havi mecha. That in fact everybody agrees in Rabbi Yochanan that you can object not in front of a person. To why in one version Rabbi Yochanan say 2 and one version Rabbi Yochanan say 3. The question here is really what the nature of mecha is at all. The one who says you only have to do a mecha in front of 2, savar sahaduta be'inan. He in fact holds that opinion in Rabbi Yochanan is that the whole point of a mecha is not necessarily spreading the word. It's establishing a fact. It's establishing 2 people who know something that counts. Sahaduta literally means testimony. Right? And that's what you need to do. You need to make people who can testify. Umandam refnei shlosha, and so the Rashbam explains that therefore, if Shimon has a field and Reuven claims he stole it illegally from me, and Reuven has said in front of at least 2 people that he did, then even though word does not get around as quickly, right? If Shimon was wanting to find out, does anybody have information about this? He would find out because these people are established witnesses. Their testimony is something that you could find out. And it's his responsibility to find out. But Manda Amar B'fnei Shlosha, the one who says you do it in front of 3 people, which I think is how we paskin, is what we've said all till now. Because Savar, he's of the opinion that Giluye Milta Be'inan. What you really need in your mecha'ah is to spread the word. You need to spread the word that this is what you think. So the onus now is on, a little bit at least, on Reuven, who was the previous owner, to say, put out there in the world, I still own this land. And Shimon then would have to keep his star. And so that's why you need 3, because like we said in Masechet Erechim, and like we've been saying throughout, you really need 3 people to assume that everybody is going to know about something. Obviously, with 2 people, some people know about it, but it's not as widespread, and the responsibility here is to be much more widespread. Now, Gido Bar Menyumi. I don't know if everyone knows where we are. We're around halfway, a little less than halfway down, right next to the Tosfot of Sahaduta. So Gido Bar Menyumi Havile Mechvuye Lemachvi. This gets to your this is your question. Gido Bar Menyumi had to make a mecha. Gido Bar Menyumi had a field. Somebody was living on his field, either a renter who claimed he owned it or a person who stole it, maybe. Gido Bar Menyumi wanted to make a mecha. So he shows up at court. He shows up in the Beit Midrash, let's say. Ashkachinu, sorry. He found Rav Huna, Rechia bar Rav, and Rav Chilkiah bar Tuve Davi Yatzvi. So he happened to come across these 3 great rabbis. These are really some of the great ones, right? Ones we know about very well. Rav Huna, Chia, the son of Rav, and Rav Chilkiah bar Tuvi. They were sitting and, discussing things and talking, whatever they were doing. And Macha Kamayo. And he said in front of them, look, I own this field I owned this field on the corner of whatever, and so Shimon is living in the field, and he's illegitimate. He shouldn't be on the field. So he did a macha in front of 3, which is sort of how you see that we paskin that you need 3, right? Now, that was the first year that Shimon was living on the field. This next year comes, and Shimon hasn't left the field. Shimon's still there. So the next year, Hadar Atalam Chuye. So he comes back and he says, I want to announce again that Shimon is living on my field illegally. And they say to him, don't worry, you don't need to make a macha again in the second year. Amrulay lo tzricha. you don't need to make another micha'ah this year because Hachi Amar Rav, remember this is Chia quoting his father Rav. So my father Rav said, Kivan shemicha shana rishona, shuv eino tzarich limchot. Once you made a micha'ah in the first year of the 3-year period, you don't have to make another micha'ah. Now, it's not clear yet. We're going to find out in a second. What's that mean, forever or for 3 years? But we're going to find out in a minute that it means in every 3-year period, right? So you have to at least once every 3 years make a micha'ah. So if you make a micha'ah in year 1, you've got to make another micha'ah in year 4, right? But once you make a micha'ah in year 1, you don't have to make a micha'ah in year 2 or year 3. Because if it's not 3 consecutive years without a micha'ah, it doesn't count as a chazaka. Okay. Now let's read. We'll see that a little bit more detail. The Ika da Amri. Some quoted it a little bit different. Again, the same story. Amar le Chia bar Rav. Chia bar Rav said to Gido bar Menyumi, Kivan shemicha shana rishona shuv ein tzarich limchot. Once you made a micha'ah in year 1 of the 3-year cycle, you don't have to make another micha'ah. And that's where Reish Lakish, Amar Reish Lakish, Mishum Bar Kapara, Reish Lakish quoted Bar Kapara saying, V'tzarech limchot b'sof kol shalosh v'shalosh. You have to make a mecha every 3 years, right? So meaning after 3 years have passed, or before 3 years have passed, you have to make a mecha at the end of a 3-year period so that 3 years do not pass without a mecha. Because even if you were mocha in year 2, let's say, if he then continues to live on the field, year 3, 4, and 5, and you don't say anything, you can say that maybe he bought it during that time, right? Maybe he bought it after you made your micha'ah. So since you didn't make another micha'ah, he would have a chazakah. So you have, according to Reish Lakish and the Bar Kapara, you have to do it every 3 years.
Well, what's the difference between where is this? And then Ika da Amri. They're just the same thing.
Yeah,
right?
so Ikadami is just a different language. That's not all 3 of them, but Chia Barav, right? So one quoted it from Hachi Amarav and one quoted it from Chia Barav. Who
Oh,
probably heard it from his father Rav.
but he was
He's a son. It's the
I
same.
understand. It wasn't he the one who said it, or no?
Well, the first opinion was that it was Hachi Amarav, is that it was a quote from his father Rav, and this one it was Chia said it. So it's just that's Ikadami. There's no difference in opinions. It's just difference in what they say.
All right, okay.
But Reish Lakish's point is critical. Now says the Gemara, Tahi ba Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was amazed, meaning he was shocked and outraged that Reish Lakish would say such a thing. Said Rabbi Yochanan, that's ridiculous. Why would you have to make a micha'ah at the end of every 3 years? Let's say on year 1, you said, this guy stole my field, right? So then, says the Gemara, V'chi gazlan, yesh lo chazakah, that he's a gazlan. He's going to have a chazakah. Remember, chazakah means a person says, I bought it, but I lost the shtar. But you accuse this guy of being a thief, right? So now no one's going to trust him if he says he lost his shtar. So the whole concept of chazakah shouldn't apply to the guy who's accused of being a thief. Now, first of all, says, what do you mean he's a thief? Gazlan Sankadaitach? What do you mean he's a thief? No one proved that he was a thief. It's an argument. Ella kig gazlan yesh chazakah, question mark. Someone who's like a gazlan, meaning someone who the previous owner of the field came and said publicly, you stole my field. Now, he might be wrong, but clearly once you hear that the previous owner of your field says, you stole my field, you have to be very careful and keep on to the shtar. Says Rabbi Yochanan, I disagree. You never can have a chazakah after that point. Because once the previous owner claims that you're on it illegitimately, the onus is on you to keep your shtar. And you should never lose that shtar. And if you do lose the shtar, you don't have a chazakah. So Reish Lakish disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan. And says the Gemara, Amar Reish Rava, that in fact Allah is like Reish Lakish. Hilchata tzarich limchot b'sof kol shalosh v'shalosh. The truth is, says Rava, halacha is not like Rabbi Yochanan, it's like Reish Lakish, that you didn't prove that he's a gazlan. He's not like, you just claim that he didn't get it. And the reality is that maybe he bought it after the fact, right? There's no reason to say after 2 years you said he's on my field illegally, or he's not a purchaser, he's a borrower, he's a renter, but then he bought it from me. And 3 years later, he has a chazakah if you don't make an or. So that's how we paskin, like Rava, that once every 3 years, you've got to stand up and say, this guy who's been on my field is not the owner. And once you say that, then he can't get it without a shtar. One more halacha. We're going to go over 4 lines.
Why isn't the matter done? Why don't they once he stands up at year 1, the previous owner, and says this person is not on my field, why doesn't it go to court then to
He
have
didn't
it
go to court.
discussed. What?
And there could be 100 reasons, but he didn't. The reality is, it's not the court's responsibility. But remember, there's a lot
No,
of
but at
scenarios-
some point he could say, "Listen, you're not on my land. What are you doing there?" And he brings it to whatever he does. But it's the year when he made a mach'ah right away when he saw this person there. So why don't we remove that person, or why don't we force him to produce a star, whatever? Why does he wait another 3 years and say, "Okay, I'm coming back now"?
I mean, there could be many, many reasons, right? But it doesn't matter, right? As the courts unless you go to court and say to the court, I want this person off my field, it's not their responsibility. So the whole point of macha is for whatever reason, you can't get him off your field, either because whatever, you could think of 100 reasons. You're not present. You're not politically powerful enough. You don't have the money to pay the court fees, whatever the reasons might be. But the other point to remember, of course, is that many cases of macha are not where he stole your land. It's where he's on your land legitimately, right? He lent you money. You gave him the land to be your guarantor for the money. So he's supposed to, you don't want to kick him off the land. You just want to establish that he didn't buy the land, right? That it's not, he doesn't own it, or he's a renter, he's a sharecropper. So in all those cases, of course, you're not going to kick him off the land. You're just going to make him mecha. Now, says Bar Kapara, 4 lines from the bottom. Tani Bar Kapara. Let's say you are ir, you make a claim that this guy is on your field illegitimately. Chazar ir, and then 3 or 4 years later, you make another claim, right? Say 3 years, because of Reish Lakish's halacha. 3 years later, you make another claim, chazar ve'ir, and then 3 years later, you make another claim, which is what Bar Kapara says you're supposed to do, according to Reish Lakish. Says Bar Kapara, just be very careful. In machmat tana rishona ir in lo chazaka. If you keep saying the same thing every time, then he doesn't have a chazaka. If after year 1 you said he took my field illegitimately, after year 4 you say he took my field illegitimately, after year 7 you say the same thing, then we trust you, and he doesn't have a chazaka. But if you change your story, im lav, if you don't have the same claim, meaning year 1 you say Shimon's on my field, but he really is a sharecropper. He doesn't own it. And then in year 4 you say Shimon's on my field, but it's because he borrowed money. I borrowed money from him and he's a guarantor. And in year 7 you say Shimon's on my field because he stole it from me. If you change your story, then you lose your whole chazaka. You lose your whole power. Then im lav yesh lo chazaka. Then we don't trust anything you say. So the Rashbam understands it. We don't trust any of your things because you clearly don't have any nemanut, any trust in this case. So you can't change your story. You've got to have one consistent story throughout about why Shimon is on your land. And if you do, then of course every 3 years you can make a mecha. But if you change your story, you lose all your credibility, and we no longer care about your mecha, and Shimon gets a chazakah, which seems pretty obvious. But Bar Kapara said it anyways.
And if he doesn't change his story, and this goes on for a year, 9 years, 12 years, is the original owner then entitled to all the payroll?
So in theory, yes, depending on what your claim is, right? Because it depends on what the person says.
Right.
If you say he stole it, right, then yes. But the problem is it's really hard to collect payroll that don't exist, right? It's hard to go back and find something. But in theory, you can collect them from him. You'd have to prove what it was, etc. Tomorrow, we will continue from the last line. It's a new case. It's a very exciting case. And we will start at 7:45 a.m., which is not that many hours from now. So everyone get a good night's rest. I hope to see you tomorrow morning. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.
Good, though.
Tov, Miriam.